My focus is on market choices. And immediately there are two further caveats. First of these is that something like 25% of households in Scotland are not housed in the market. They're in the social or non-profit or council sectors. And to a large extent, they don't make a housing choice in the conventional sense of the word, but are allocated housing that may contain choice-based elements. And it will be that if people are keen to make these schemes work, there has to be potentially much greater attention to the kinds of issues that households use when they're sifting and selecting their housing market options. I also recognise that for, say, a third of those who do live in, who find their housing in the market sector, they don't have broad choices. Choice is generally a good process, at least have your resources to make a variety of different choices. So the fact that roughly half the population in Scotland either don't make a choice or can only make a narrow choice means that we have to look at market choices, but the market is not everything in all of this. Well, when we look at the question of how households make a choice, they choose not just a dwelling and its size, its internal structures, even particularly now the importance of the energy standard and insulation standards of dwellings. I lived some of my life in Canada, and I often reflect that if Canadian houses were as badly insulated as those in Glasgow, and in Glasgow's tenemental and public stock, there'd be a lot of Canadians would die in the winter time. So insulation is going to be a much more important issue for us as we become more concerned about carbon and heating of dwellings. But there's also a context of environmental qualities that people appreciate, like a view or whatever. There's the social characteristics of the neighbourhood and its social capital. And there's access to public and private facilities. And all of these things are essential to live life. That home is also not just a physical structure that meets various household consumption activities. It's not the neighbourhood, but it also sets the household in the context of the activity patterns or points that they use throughout a metropolitan area. In other words, it's access not just to local services, but to jobs, to places where people play, places where people shop, and indeed where they learn. The empirical evidence is that the size and type of house, and whether it's a garage or not, on average accounts for about 60% of the value of a dwelling. So dwelling characteristics are important in the choice. Locational factors, typically 20%, and other factors, and especially the physical quality of the environment, explains much of the remainder of the 10%. It's also the case in the empirical evidence in the literature from housing economics is that the demand for different housing attributes, in other words, whether you choose more quality environment or more space or more accessibility, these demands for individual attributes depend on household age, household type, and of course, income. So that if we're going to talk about how some event is going to change the demand for housing, we really need to know how this affects not just prices, but incomes and the choices that people will make. I think that what we have in the contemporary Scottish context is that we actually have very little contemporary research on the demand for individual housing attributes. We base market commentaries, we base policies, we're developing a whole lot of ideas like 20-minute neighbourhood, the future of city centres, and there's virtually no evidence on how the demand for housing attributes, locations and neighbourhoods demand systematically, very systematically with housing, with household income sizes and the like. These are very, very, very important issues. And of course, the choices reflect the household activity patterns that people have, how they use the neighbourhood, how they use their street, how they use the facilities round about, how they use the city centre. And again, very little systematic Scottish evidence. So we develop our housing policies and our planning policies without really hard evidence to develop. We take up fashionable ideas, whether it's the 20-minute city or back to the city centre living, and we maybe follow market trends, but we very rarely predict how they will happen. So I just want to make that very clear. So what do we do when we don't have evidence? Well, often social scientists will rely on theory. Well, the urban economic theory of household choices assumes a metropolitan area in which employment is located predominantly in the city core, and that people basically trade off access to that employment against the size of their dwelling. And that model essentially sees poor people living at high density close to city centres, whereas those that are more affluent head to the burbs to bigger lot sizes, and of course that involves cheaper land towards the metropolitan edge. Well, I would say that that theoretical conception that guides our understanding has never worked in the metropolitan structures of the UK, nor indeed most European city systems, and it has been irrelevant, particularly as employment has dispersed to the edge of metropolitan areas, and indeed as more affluent households have demonstrated a propensity to live back at high quality in city cores. And one characteristic of both Glasgow and Edinburgh since the 1980s has been a rising number of relatively high quality, high income households, quite often younger households in professional employment, living close to city cores. So don't look to theory. John Maynard Keynes said, theory is a refuge from mystery and doubt. In this case, you won't get any refuge from mystery and doubt by looking at urban economic theory. So we don't have the evidence, and we don't have very good conceptual understandings about housing choice. That said, in the absence of hard evidence, we therefore have to grasp at some straws of broad trends in reshaping the pattern of housing demand. One would expect that population ageing, with more 1 and 2 member households as a proportion of the population as my generation survived longer, later family formation for younger households who are not able to, in a sense, launch families or own dwellings till later in their 30s very often, and rising real property costs, they should all be driving a demand for smaller homes. And in fact, that's often been the case in the flatted end of the market, people living in smaller homes and indeed at higher densities. But it's not been true in the middle and the upper areas of the housing market. And that's partly because for elderly households who are above middle income, their consumption requirements in housing are much less than the consumption services that their dwellings can actually produce. But they choose to live, they choose to remain where they are because the fact that these properties increase in value faster than most other assets that are available to them. So half the dwelling is basically a matter of speculation rather than serving housing needs and indeed housing demands. And a really important element in housing policy should be to unlink that. And there's different ways to do it. Scottish Government's interest in trying to move towards a much lower house price inflation system in the longer term would solve some of that issue. But if we look at our big cities, there's over-consumption of housing by older households. It's a more serious problem, I'd suggest, than under-consumption of housing by elderly households. So these things should affect housing choices. We also know that the rising costs of dealing with carbon, either through higher fuel prices or ultimately with some form of carbon tax, should raise the demand for well-insulated homes. It should also encourage people to use smaller homes, and prior to COVID, micro homes were a beginning feature in large metropolitan areas. But they also, in a sense, should be driving individuals to seek better access to work. Now, that, of course, is being countered by the fact that COVID has highlighted that an increasing number of people are able to work from home. Before the onset of the COVID pandemic, about 8% of households in Scotland in employment worked at home for all of their working time. 18%, a further 18% worked at home for some regular part of their time. So up to a quarter of people were, in a sense, already softening that access space, if you like, trade-off by actually only traveling to work or commuting to work on a less frequent basis. By April in the pandemic, 62% of Scots were actually predominantly working from home. In fact, 52% were working at home, and 24% of all firms, all of their employees were working at home. So that's a sea change, and potentially a lasting change, as many people are learning that this is a form of business that works for their employers in terms of productivity. There are limits to that because of strategic decision taking, team building, and so on. But that's likely to lead less frequent travel per week rather than constant travel per week. But undoubtedly, COVID has reinforced this trend. In terms of the evidence of effects in the cities, since the 1980s, there have been increased populations living at higher densities in Scotland's two core cities, and Glasgow and Edinburgh particularly. But more recently, there's been an increased outflow of younger households from core cities because of pressures of housing affordability in good quality city centre areas. And that's induced longer commuting, longer travelling costs. A very significant proportion, for instance, of Edinburgh's workforce really lives in Dunfermline and commutes back and forward on a pretty frequent basis. And that's been partly induced by housing affordability issues. And what we've seen in that context is that well-connected suburbs and well-connected towns have been gaining faster in the last 5 years in terms of population. So this is a pre-COVID effect that will be reinforced by the kind of new working and travelling arrangements that people are confronting. On top of that, there's also an interurban shift from the most pressured conurbations, particularly in the southeast of England, to the other conurbations of the UK. There's always a return migrant rate to these areas and metropolitan housing markets, but it has speeded up in the last 10 years, and it's having an effect in town and well-connected rural markets. Now, that's an advantage if you're concerned about driving growth in these areas. We have to think housing policy. How some places can be magnets to, in a sense, attract these moving households. We don't do enough of that thinking in Scottish housing policy, nor in economic development policy. There's a new marriage needs to be made in that regard, but it's something we need to think through. So COVID has undoubtedly reinforced these tendencies, and some of them will be permanent, but the housing system in Scotland in September 2021 will look pretty much like what it was in September 2019. I almost got the year wrong. This has been longer than I think. So that we know things will have changed, but won't have changed out of all recognition. Other issues, the risk of travel on mass transit systems is now recognised in terms of pandemic and infection. People do have some expectation that this is not the last pandemic they'll see in their lifetime. Then they might be much less inclined to, I beg your pardon, I had to get rid of a phone. They're going to be much less inclined to live in locations where they require long commutes on mass transit. That's working against the sustainable development argument, as also is the fact that if people are conscious of density as being a contributor to disease transmission of some kind or another, then they may also be moving against more dense housing choices. I think it's important to counteract that, because it's very clear high quality design does not necessarily mean multi-story high-rise flats, and it doesn't necessarily mean people interacting in a very negative way. So again, in terms of city planning and housing, we've really got to get on top of that. In terms of housing investment, we'll be back to the question of asset choices in housing. I think that 65–70% Scottish households have not had their income seriously affected by COVID up until now, nor indeed will they have them affected. And a consequence of that will be they're also likely to be middle and upper income households. They're still interested in home ownership. The cost of borrowing is exceptionally low. So one would expect to see, actually, despite the economic downturn, which is going to be impacting particular people, that sustained pressure on housing with complications in housing supply, we'll see a steady commitment to choosing housing as an investment stream. And again, the Scottish Government concern to avoid these difficulties is important. I could actually say something further about choices in the rental market. I think the Scottish policy in this area, with bearing down on Airbnb, with legislation moving against short-term lets, I think actually will have a damaging effect on the economy of the centre of Scottish cities. Not all people that use these properties are noisy people going to inn and stag parties. Many of them are young professionals moving around within the corporate system for training, other job-related activities. And I think that there has to be a much more coherent recognition of the fact that the problem is really shortage of rented housing, whether market or non-market, and governments really have to deal with that. So I think that we are distorting rented choices in fairly significant ways. That said, one recognises that too many poorer households have choices that are much too expensive in terms of proportions of their incomes. So that's a dilemma that we need much clearer thinking on in terms of moving forward. So when we look at these things, and just drawing this to a close and apologising for taking longer, but also for the phone interruptions, COVID effects, they've made us change. Some of these changes will remain, and others, we will actually see them slightly fade away in the next year or two. But our choices individually and collectively are not the same as they were a year ago. Our absence of evidence about what the real patterns are is much the same as it was a year ago, and we have to remedy that as we move forward. Thank you.